Shalom and welcome to Shikol Da'at. I am Rabbi Josh Rose. This week in the Torah we read about the revelation at Mount Sinai. This moment is the fulfillment of the entire redemption. It was not enough that the Jewish people should go free from suffering in Egypt. They had to do that so that they could understand how to live a life of freedom with purpose and meaning. This they would do by learning about the rules for individual and communal life, rooted in human dignity, decency, compassion, and justice. And that is what happens this week in the Torah when they receive the 10 Commandments. But the revelation was not only the apex of Jewish life up to that point. It also formed the foundation for Jewish life in the future. So how we interpret what happened at Mount Sinai is how we interpret what it means to live a Jewish life. As Moses is up on the mountain communing with God, the Torah tells us that the Jewish people, Vayiyatzvu b'tachti tahar, they stood up at the foot of the mountain. Rav Adimi Bar Chama, who's a sage in the Talmud, focuses in on the phrase foot of the mountain, which in Hebrew is tachtit. Now literally, this word means under or underneath. He says that really that's really the proper way to translate it. So he says in the Talmud, this means that the Blessed Holy One held the mountain over their heads like a cask and said, "If you accept the Torah, well and good, but if not, here is your grave." So Rav Adimi shares a shocking interpretation that God threatened the Israelites at the moment of the revelation of the Torah in order to force them to accept it. Why would God want a forced commitment from the Jewish people? A life of spiritual uplift and inspiration surely would have to be made by free choice, or at least we would think. And that's exactly what Rav Avdimi's interlocutor says as the story continues. His name is Rav Acha Bar Yaakov. So he responds to this story by saying that this story about God's threat to the Jewish people, quote, proves that their acceptance of the Torah was without consent and therefore not valid. This is an astonishing idea. So remember that the Jewish tradition is covenantal. At its heart, that means that God and the Jewish people have accepted a mutual agreement called a brit. That's where the mitzvot come from. Everything in Jewish life, from Jewish learning to Jewish praying to keeping kosher to observing Shabbat to Jewish ethics and the obligations of tzedakah, everything. And Rav Acha is saying that the covenant made at Sinai wasn't valid. The one we read about this week in the Torah was not valid because we were forced into it. And I think that most of us would side with Rav Acha. Living Jewishly, because if you don't, God will drop a mountain on your head, doesn't sound like a very compelling vision of spiritual life. While you may not have been threatened with geological catastrophe growing up, the compulsion model of Jewish observance is probably familiar to many of us. We faced it when we were kids at the hands of our parents, and now we excise any lingering resentment of that by forcing it on our own children, at least sometimes. We'll follow this teaching in a moment, the continuation of the story, but first, an important aside. I want to say here that I think that the first rabbi, Rav Avdimi Bar Chama, who tells us about God holding the mountain up, was getting at something more than God just being a giant bully. Let's ask why God would make that threat. So remember that in the Torah, the Jewish people carry the blessing of Abraham, who was assured that one day his descendants would be a blessing to the entire world. So from God's perspective, so to speak, the entire purpose of human life is at stake at Mount Sinai. And the Jewish people, who are so twisted up from their Egypt experience, might only see Torah as a burden. They might not be able to look past that to see how it can make the world more holy. However, there's another way to see it. Could the mountain held over their heads be a metaphor? Maybe Rav Avdimi is saying that if they don't accept this teaching, which will help them build holy lives in a holy world, then it won't be a life at all. Rav Avdimi is trying to teach us maybe about what it truly means to live life. But back to the teaching from the Talmud. A third voice comes in and agrees that the revelation at Sinai couldn't be valid precisely because it was forced, with that mountain being held over their heads. This comes from Rava, a great sage of the 4th century, and he says, nonetheless, in spite of the fact that it wasn't valid, the Jewish people later accepted the Torah during the days of Achashverosh. As it is written, the Jews upheld and accepted. He's quoting now from the book of Esther. That is, they upheld what had been accepted previously. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here, so let's walk through it. Achashverosh is the king in the Purim story, or the book of Esther. You may have noticed that God doesn't appear in the book of Esther. In fact, the rabbis connected the heroine's name, Esther, to a verse in the book of Deuteronomy, that's in the Torah, where God says, I will hide my face, astir panai. That means that God is looking forward to a time when the Jewish people will have strayed so far that God's presence in the world will be very difficult to discover because God will have, quote, hidden his face, end quote. So we associate Purim with silliness and celebration now, so this may seem strange to you, what I've just said, but the story itself, if you read it, is one of horrible violence and suffering and danger for the Jewish people. So God is said to be hidden in that story, not only because God doesn't appear as a character in the story, but because all of these horrible events, and it looks like God is not in the world anymore. You can hear the connection between the name Esther and the word astir, to hide. So why is Rava connecting this week's Torah portion, the revelation in this high point for our relationship to God, with a seemingly irrelevant passage in the book of Esther? Rava points us to a verse in the 9th chapter of that book where it says, Kimu v'kiblu ha-Yehudim, the Jews upheld and accepted. That's the verse that he's focusing on to make the argument that the Jews accepted the Torah. So what's that about? So even though in the Esther story itself that what they upheld and accepted is not the Torah, but rather they upheld and accepted to observe Purim in gratitude from being saved from the danger in the story, nonetheless Rava says that in fact what it refers to is that they willingly upheld and accepted not just Purim, but the entire Torah. There are many tough questions that come from this teaching, but right now I want to focus on what I think is the heart of this incredible connection. Look at the contrast he's drawing between Mount Sinai and the situation in the book of Esther. At Sinai, the Jews saw God everywhere, and they heard God. They had an incredible vision of God at the Sea of Reeds, pillars of fire and cloud following and protecting them, and now they're at Mount Sinai. And that's where they were forced to accept the Torah, with a mountain over their heads. In the book of Esther, by contrast, God is nowhere to be found. They need God because of the great danger that they face, but they can't find God anywhere. God is hidden. And yet, according to Rava, that's the time that they accept the Torah willingly, so it becomes binding. That's when they can freely choose to live lives of meaning and purpose. So I ask you, which is more familiar to us, Sinai or the world of Esther? I think it's the second. We look around to a world that can feel empty, abandoned, spiraling out of control sometimes. Reaching out for a life of goodness under those circumstances, our circumstances, seems like the truest kind of revelation. The test isn't whether we can enjoy a cozy world when everything is going well for us. And it isn't insisting that we'll live upright lives if God shows him or herself, or if God inspires us, or if someone else inspires us. The test is whether we can stand up in a world that feels dead and bring it to life by our own courage, by our own strength, by our own character, and our own commitment. That's what it takes to stand on Sinai, when we're free and we sense that our world needs our Torah. That's what it means to bring heaven and earth a little closer.